All right, we're starting off with pre-registration and pre-analysis plans, or where every good project should start. To discuss this with me here today, we have James Torito, who's a senior research manager at JPL North America and works on the American Economic Association's RCT registry. On the line, remotely joining from the Center for Open Science, we have Nikki Pfeiffer, who's the director of product working on the OSF registries. On my left, I have Cecilia Moe, who's an assistant professor at, in political science at UC Berkeley, and is the co-author of a paper on observational open science, which is a toolkit for verifying the credibility of observational studies. And then we have Meredith Basie, who's the executive director for North America at Universities Aligned for Essential Medicines, a nonprofit which works to promote access to essential medicines through increased transparency in research. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Each panelist is going to talk for about 5 minutes. After each presentation, we're open for clarifying short questions, but please save your longer, more substantive questions for later. We're going to have plenty of time for that. And yeah, so let's get started. The act of registration means to publicly declare research that one plans to conduct. And ideally, this is done before analyzing the data, and this is done also in a publicly accessible registry. Registries, when serving their purpose, allow us to catalog the universe of research, regardless of whether it ends up being published in a journal or not. And then the role of pre-analysis plans is to tie up one's hands before analyzing the data as means of limiting bias and as a way of limiting bias. However, we're yet to test the potential of registries in allowing the reporting of null results, and the problem of underreporting null results is something that we're here to discuss today. I'm going to invite James to kick us off to talk about the work of the AEA registry in promoting post-trial reporting.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name is James Torito. If you're not familiar with who I am, I know I recognize a few people in the room. I work at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. We host the AEA's registry and manage and develop the registry itself on behalf of them. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the background of what we've done with the registry and what improvements we've made over the last few years, what changes we've seen, and then talk a little bit more about the conversation we actually just had. I pulled together a lot of numbers over the last few days with my colleague Kiesler, who also works on the registry with us, to talk about where we are in terms of the state of post-trial reporting on the registry at the AEA. I'll reference a few of these slides as I go along. I also have some more data I'll put up on the OSF page that Alex has set up later to talk about some of the numbers I discuss. So JPL has been running and supporting the registry on behalf of the AEA since early 2012. It was originally set up in 2013, and we really, our founders really pushed to get it started and worked with the AEA's board to initiate the registry. It is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I imagine most people are, it's a trial registry for field experiments in the social sciences. JPL is largely involved with it because we are really want to see the growth of rigorous research not just in development economics, but in the social sciences more broadly. So we have been supporting it for since the beginning. As you can see, there's been a large growth over the last 6 years from the early few years where people were slowly starting to register until now, and starting in 2018, the growth has really started to climb, and it's doubled almost in the last year and a half, which is great to see. Part of this is because in 2018, the American Economics Association started requiring registration for researchers who are interested in publishing field experiments in their journals. And so that's certainly been one of the other reasons why it's grown. But at JPEL, we've really seen the registry, as I've mentioned, trying to make it more rigorous and understanding how we can increase the quality of reporting on the registry. So we've done a number of things over the years to do that. In 2017, we introduced a registry review process where every registry submission is reviewed by someone in our office to make sure that the quality, that it's logically constructed. We don't make any evaluations on the research itself. We just want to make sure that the entries are complete. In early 2019, well, we started in 2018, we started introducing DOIs to the registry. It took a little while to get started, and we launched that in August 2019 of this year. One of the other things we've been trying to do this year is just make the registry data more accessible for any researchers who are interested in doing meta-analyses or just exploring the data on the registry itself. So we've really been trying to work on this. We hope by the end of this year we might be able to have some improvements and updates to the website, including more information about how you can download the data, potentially also just uploading snapshots of the registry to the Dataverse or some other digital repository, or then if you're doing research on the AEA, you can just cite the DOI or cite the data set. And then what we're now turning gears towards is thinking more about post-trial reporting and how to incentivize post-trial reporting. So this is the conversation that we've been having already. It's what the conversation is going to be most of the day. And so Kiesler and I, as well as a few colleagues, are thinking about how to run tests on incentivizing researchers to go back and report their results. And these are, small little tests, A/B experiments, maybe mostly. Nothing too complex, just really looking at, is this an issue of the user interface? People don't know where to go to log in to find the fields they could report on. So what you see on, I guess, the right here is just an example. So we have about 2,100, a little over 2,100 studies that have now passed their trial end date. Of these studies, 1,100 of them are still reported as some sort of active status. So they're either in development or they're still active. And so what this is showing you is a number of studies past their trial end date and the kind of dates, the number of days after their trial end date, where people haven't gone and updated the results of their study, or just updated some of the basic information about their study, saying that the study has been completed. And so therefore, we don't have a good sense of what is the stage of the study. Maybe they need to change the end date of the study because there have been delays on the study. Maybe they need to change the status of the study to say that it is now completed. So we're starting to think about a lot more of these questions in terms of how can we get people back in to just report on the status of their trials. And so there's other things we've looked at as well. Only 25% of the studies in the registry that do have completed or have passed their trial end date have actually updated their completed, like when the trial ended in the registry. Only 6% have actually updated the fact that they have data available online, so they've provided URLs. And so we have a couple of other fields. I was excited to listen to the idea of a null results template, because we do have a field for updating preliminary reports and uploading preliminary reports. Unfortunately, less than 1% of the entries actually have a template that's been uploaded or some sort of report that's been uploaded to that field. We do have about 16% of our studies or trials that do fall into this category of past the trial end date have uploaded some sort of paper or study in their post-trial field as well. So we have a number of post-trial fields in the registry. We're thinking about how to really better get people to update these fields or just report their results. Micah's question, I think, about behavior change is an important one. You know, is this something that, you know, if we make this available, how can we get researchers to go in and do it? Obviously, there are a lot of time constraints and issues that were raised in the previous talk. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts more on how we can think about this. I just wanted, you know, to show that this is available on the registry now, on the AA registry, and so thinking, you know, more today about how we can make these results more complete, or these fields and reporting more complete would be great.
If there are any follow-up questions. Okay, then we can take on with Nikki, who's going to talk about the efforts of the Center for Open Science, or through their open science, through the OSF registry in supporting the reporting of results of studies registered there.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. And thanks for letting me sort of telepanel in. So I put together a slide that I'm going to share a little bit of background on, but I really want to get into more about the ecosystem and improvements that could really help support the needs we've identified today. So as you can see, in a short time, registration submissions through OSF registries have grown considerably. I think this really demonstrates some shifts towards adoption of open and reproducible research practices. This is showing since 2012, when we first launched the capability on OSF, and where we were at the end of last year. And I can give you some preliminary numbers on 2019 with 12,491 new registrations in addition to the existing. So it would put us way above the top of this graph, and that was as of November 30th. And the graph on the right is probably hard for you to see, but I'll share a little bit about it. It's looking at of the several different form types that OSF registries offers. The main ones are pre-registration, and you can see that those are the ones getting the significant use, which I think is exciting to see, and hopefully continues to be the trend. When we talk about OSF registries and sort of the goals behind it, it's really about supporting that streamlined researcher workflow. We recently made a bunch of improvements, and we have many more planned. In 2020, we've updated the way a registration appears. We've separated out sort of the template responses from the metadata that sits around the registration, just so that we can really help with the discovery of a registration and making that editable, even that metadata editable after the registration, so it continues to live on. Sometimes you might tag it initially, but not think through the real long tail of that research and be able to add tags and change titles and do different things to really help that get out in front of other researchers doing similar work who would need to know about it. Also, it's just worth mentioning, all of our registrations that are made public are available through an API, which makes them indexable in other repositories if they wanted to pull them in. And it also makes them machine readable by the way we've implemented the templates using schema blocks. So I think those are some great pieces of functionality that we've already put together, and things that we are planning to do in the near and long term is to allow some more versioning of a registration. A pre-registration might need to be updated as the study progresses. Right now, it's possible, but it doesn't really link them together in a meaningful way with the timeline kind of built in. Additionally, logic in the forms, so that depending on the research study you know, the responses may be predicated on the previous answer. So, you know, obviously that's a small efficiency, but it's one that over time, when you know, realize what is required in reporting these pre-registrations and then the outcomes in the end, the things that don't apply would be nice not to have to work through. And then finally, reporting outcomes on registrations is something that I think you all are bringing up, and I think is really a need in the community at large, but then something we can implement in our infrastructure pretty easily by taking a previous pre-registration and just nudging a researcher to say, it's been a while, you got any results to report? And finally, a thing that we're working on right now that will be coming out in 2020 is branded registries, so that we can give communities the tools to cultivate these new standards of rigor and integrity in their field. So this could be the way in which to launch a null results registry, where maybe IPL's null results reporting template could be one of the custom templates that we could enable, so that researchers could take those steps when they do get to the end, and have it become searchable and discoverable, meant to DOI on it, all of those good things that we want, so it's part of the long-term scholarly record of the research that's been conducted. I do want to take a couple seconds too to just talk about the broader ecosystem. A couple things that we've been working on that might be really relevant to this conversation. We partnered with Sloan to fund a study that we're conducting. It's a credibility of preprint study. And so this is kind of interesting in that we've done the first part of it. We've conducted a survey. We've gotten 3,700 and some respondents. And all of what we asked them was, what are the signals of trust in a preprint? Because we recognize that a preprint is not a journal article. We know the things that sort of are used to give credibility to that: the publisher, the editors, the reviewers. Those things are sort of what signal to the reader that this is credible, and I can trust the work that's been, you know, relayed to me. However, not so much with preprints, but we really want to see that take off and be more normative. And so what are ways we could start to facilitate that with preprints? And the responses came back really indicating that it was the open science practices that were providing credibility. So things like data, materials, and pre-registration add credibility to that preprint. So we're actually going to be adding these fields in 2020 to our OSF preprint submission. So that includes the OSF preprints and all of the 25 branded services that we host on our infrastructure. So it's going to ask those authors to provide their data availability statements, links to their data materials, and any pre-registrations. We're going to experiment a little bit on that to see what the outcomes look like, given certain signals of trust, whether that preprint gets more views or more downloads or more citations. So we'll have more results on that later, but I think already the survey's response is really indicative of where we're headed. The other thing I wanted to bring up that I think we were touching on is this registered reports model. So when you talk about having journals review the research prior to the outcomes, the study results being known, this is an opportunity to get in principle acceptance. It is the way in which no results would be published, and there is a manuscript version that happens to come out in the initial rounds. There's further review, but you get that buy-in at the beginning from the publisher and the researcher through the review process. We recently joined up with the Flu Lab, which is a collaboration of a funder and PLOS, a publisher, and COS, to actually do this registered report model with funders and a publisher at the same time. So this is really exciting to see how this shakes out. We're in the early stages, so I don't have a ton to report on that, but it's something to keep in touch about, where you kind of get that alignment from the beginning. I think that's all I have, unless there's questions.
Great, thank you, Nikki.
Sure.
I want to give the floor now to Meredith. Meredith, you work for an organization that has done a lot of research on to what extent clinical trials are being reported on. Can you tell us a bit more about the current trends and what you see as the biggest challenges?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Meredith, as Alec mentioned. So just to give a little bit of background, first of all, to UAM, so it's sort of clear where we're coming from. UAM, or Universities Allied for Essential Medicine, is sort of a global network of students. It actually started at Yale. It was a Yale and then a Berkeley grad, so I thought I should mention that. But back at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, there was a drug that had been developed at Yale University with public funds, but it was priced out of reach for people in South Africa. And Doctors Without Borders were looking to treat people living with HIV for the first time. And so these students, they were law students primarily, they organized and they convinced Yale to change the license between the pharmaceutical corporation and the university, and it led to a 90% reduction in the price of that drug, and Doctors Without Borders were able to treat people living with HIV for the first time. Today, this is a global organization. We have students in 20 different countries, and we're organizing around making publicly funded medicines affordable for people, which is obviously a massive challenge, not just in low and middle income countries anymore, but right here in the US, where 1 in 3 people can no longer afford their prescription drugs. So we felt that we had an opportunity with universities and our sort of broad network of students to push universities to in the sort of space of clinical trial transparency, right? So this is a newer space for us in the last couple of years, but we put out a report in conjunction with a group called TransparyMed out of the UK, looking at the top 40 biomedical universities in the United States to see what they were doing. And it turns out that it's not just sort of the ethical and moral obligation to be reporting your clinical trials. It is actually the law. So in 2007, there was the FDA Amendments Act, and then in 2017, there was this final rule that said that there's sort of a long paragraph about how specific these trials are, but interventional trials involving patients would need to be registered and reported within 12 months of completion of the trial. And what we saw, that even with this law in existence, is that only 15 of those top 40 universities were in compliance with the law. So we looked at 450 trials, and 140 of those more or less, were still not reported. And you can go to, there's a website called the Trials Tracker that pulls from clinicaltrials.gov, but you can see, you can put in your university and see the current status of trials, etc. And you can see also that in theory, the FDA could have, to this day, receive fines of up to $5 billion US, which they have not collected, which is interesting. All of those 140 trials that I mentioned, in theory, you can be fined $10,000 per trial per day of non-reporting. Now, what we've seen is that this report came out in March of this year from us, which is, we're a non-profit organization. We certainly are not fining anyone $10,000 per day to do anything. However, we did get a number of journalists to call some of the worst offenders. So that included Columbia, NYU, UCSF. And what was pretty fascinating to us and important is that we then received information from the folks who managed the trials tracker to say that there was a statistically significant increase in the number of trials being reported immediately after this report. So it turns out that I think, this is in this case with clinical trials, there is this incentive not to get fined, but the FDA is not doing this. But as we know, universities don't like bad press. And so I think having external actors as well pushing for the law is critical. And for those universities that are 100% compliant, we're now urging them to go a step further there was a WHO joint statement on clinical trials transparency that came out in May of 2017. It was signed by Gates and the Wellcome Trust and Doctors Without Borders, I think about 25 other very important groups around the world, committing to essentially registering and reporting all trials that they were funding. And it has taken some time for them to even be compliant with themselves. But we found that not a single academic institution has signed on to this. And so we're now trying to work with those institutions that are leading the field, or at least compliant with the law, to go a step further and think about what it would take for them to register all trials. So I can leave it there.
Great, thank you. Cecilia, you've done quite a bit of work on introducing open science to observational research. To what extent is registration and pre-analysis plans viable in observational research?
Yep, no, that's a great question, and I'm really glad to be here and hear all of your perspectives. I'm going to sort of shift the focus a little bit. It's conversations about concerns around null effects not being sufficiently published. When we're looking at replication studies, starting to notice sort of an opposite, where there's an underreporting of sort of good replications, where it's like, okay, we totally reproduced that finding. Doesn't seem really interesting, so that's not really being submitted to journals, or maybe editors are not as interested in publishing it because it's not particularly exciting. So then what we end up having is a series of replication studies that kind of have what political scientists, a team calls sort of the gotcha bias, or a team of economists call it sort of an overturn bias, right? That there seems to be more studies, reproduction studies, that are really about overturning a finding. And maybe, if there are 10 studies, 9 of them replicated and 1 of them didn't. That doesn't mean that a study and a finding has been overturned, right? When 90% of the time it did replicate. But then if we're looking at publications, if only that 10% is being reported, then we have some concerns and really understanding of the validity of a finding. So that was one concern that I had, and teamed up with a team at Stanford and at Yale to sort of think through that. In addition, at least within my field, a lot of really important studies are being done with observational data. And when we're thinking about the paradigms that have been created in terms of open science and research transparency, it makes sense that, given the origins of these conversations, they're really geared towards thinking about experiments and not observational data. But when we're thinking about some really important questions, say about voting, conflict, macroeconomic outcomes, that data has been generated, right? We can't sort of go back in time and rerun sort of the history of data gathering. So that data is there. So this idea of registering some kind of approach before the data has been generated is not viable. But at the same time, when we're looking at how studies are being done with observational data, we're seeing some problems with things like specification search or subsetting data in ways that are convenient. So there's issues in terms of what scholars are doing as it relates to observational data that really then requires having some thoughts and conversations about how do you have transparent, credible data on these really important questions around conflict and elections and so forth that are things that we can really believe in, and how do we build on scholarship in a way, how do we incentivize sort of the building and generating of studies so that we're not getting sort of an overrepresentation of statistically significant findings initially, and then an overrepresentation of overturned sort of like null effect findings thereafter, right? So those are sort of the parameters that we were thinking about, and at least as a first approach, and we don't think that this is sort of the full solution here, but at least to just start a conversation. We started thinking about 5 features that could be helpful. So I'll just lay out the 5 features and definitely excited to sort of hear your thoughts as this is work in progress. So the first feature, at least as we're thinking about observational data, is that sort of the analog of like collecting new data is sort of leveraging the passage of time, right? So when we're thinking about, I do work as it relates to elections. Sort of, there's a study that takes place, it comes out in 1984. You wait a couple cycles, there's a few more elections, and that's new data, right? And so thinking about that new data and seeing like, okay, well, if we then run the analysis again with this added data, then like what do then the magnitudes look like at that point, right? Do they go up? Do they go small? Does the measurement error go down? So really thinking about the passage of time is something that's really important in thinking about reflecting on important studies that use observational data. A second feature that we sort of underestimated the value of was not just going to Dataverse or these registries and downloading the original data set that was created by the original authors. So we're noticing with kind of important data, there's coding, there's merging, and there's the raw data. So when we were trying to sort of implement our approach, we noticed that there were errors that the original authors made, and it wasn't malicious, right? So like they may have reported in their study that they, divided and standardized in some way. We look at their coding, and in fact, we realize it didn't happen. And then sometimes it's not consequential. One moment with our replication, we actually realized it was deeply consequential. It changed the result, right? And so it was a way in which we are just kind of re-examining things, and thankfully the exchange was really positive because the error that was made was by an author that was part of our team. And so he looked at it with humility and was like, oh my goodness, this was really bad, but really grateful that this exercise sort of revealed that, because it meant that something that was out there, peer-reviewed in a great outlet, were results that weren't actually true, right? And so this exercise of sort of replicating and doing it from scratch and trying to really do what the author sort of indicated kind of gives us this opportunity to sort of verify one another, not in a policing kind of way, but just to sort of check, because humans make errors, right? There's a lot of things that happen to get from the data to the final sort of analysis. We also noticed that even for the years in which the data existed before, with the passage of time, sometimes the raw data gets better, right? So the creators of the raw data realize that, ooh, this missing data, like we accidentally coded it as 0, but that's not really 0, it's missing. And so there were some issues with sort of the raw data. And so over time, we noticed that raw data for periods of time that there was data for before actually got better. And so there's this opportunity to sort of re-examine the quality of data when you are going through the exercise of building things from scratch, as opposed to just simply downloading something from the original authors. A third feature is we really thought, this is a panel about pre-analysis plans and pre-registering analyses. We found that there is real value in doing that as it relates to observational data because of concerns around specification search. There's some of my colleagues who said, why don't we just kind of look at things with a full range of different kinds of specifications and have sort of like a lower bound and an upper bound and so forth. But when we're looking at sort of what the world looks like, there's some specifications that really theoretically make more sense than others. So sort of thinking that all specifications are equally valuable also doesn't quite make sense. And so this process of doing the pre-registering, it meant that there was this really rich dialogue with original authors, a community of scholars around what is the right set of specifications to really consider, right? And so documenting that was one that I think was very illuminating for thinking about how do you really test a theory in the best way we can, given the state of the world and the data that we have. That conversation was happening as a result of trying to do a pre-registration. And then we found that, for moments in which we needed to deviate from the pre-analysis plan when writing things up, it meant that we were sort of tying our hands so that we can actually separate out, this was not pre-registered, but we did this for this reason, right? And so the pre-registration process was really helpful in that regards. We also found that when we're thinking about replications, if possible, so when we're thinking about developed literatures, this is more possible, right? So theories that were tested with multiple studies. So when we simultaneously do multiple replications to really test a theory, then that chance of a false positive or false negative goes down because we're looking at multiple studies simultaneously and really thinking thoughtfully about what is the best way to test a theory. So the multiple simultaneous replications we found was a way to also be helpful, and also sort of thinking about when we replicate and we find different results, why might that be? Because all of these studies purported to be testing the same theory and purported to like have evidence that, you know, led to some kind of conclusion when testing the same question. And then finally, this might be a little bit more controversial, but we did, you know, given these sort of incentives, we found that building a team is one that could be quite useful here. So in an effort to try to kind of do the approach that we were laying out, we built a team that was comprised of some original authors and some new authors. So thinking about if there is this incentive to p-hack initially, and then an incentive to null hack later, why don't we build a team with mixed incentives, right? And so in doing that, it meant, well, if we can have a team with mixed incentives sort of all agree around the parameters of the study, and then sort of police each other in the writing up of it to sort of tie each other's hands, then that sort of really helps with kind of the value and the philosophy of what it means to do transparent, reproducible, honest research. And it also helped address some of the concerns around the fact that with observational studies, the data is already generated, right? So we had questions of the data is already generated, how can we trust that you didn't sort of peek and then write it and then write your conclusion, right? So it turns out when you have a team of people, we're all sort of keeping each other honest, right? So what we did was, you know, we had the data, we tried to not merge things together until we had our pre-registration, but being able to say, here's 5 of us, we can all say, like without a doubt, that we did not look before we did this, right? There's an element of trust, even with experiments, like there's an element of trust here, of you know, hoping that there's not sort of any bad actors or deceptive behavior, but at least sort of having this collaboration was one I think that was really helpful in putting out that, you know, we're policing each other, and chances it's really hard to have 5 people simultaneously like hold on to the same lie, right? So in having the collaboration, it minimizes the chance of that. Certainly in kind of following our approach that we did find some limitations and so forth, but we wanted to at least start this conversation about how do we think about sort of the null hacking concerns about replications, and then how do we think about bringing the philosophy of open research and transparency with observational data, because there's so many really big important questions that need to be answered that really rely on data that's already been generated.
Thank you. Quick follow-up question on that. In your perspective, to what extent are the current registries well equipped to provide infrastructure to register observational research? Did you find that
So,
any
yeah.
modifications were necessary?
Yeah, thankfully, you know, EGAP didn't police our pre-analysis plan and sort of notice, like, wait a second, this is not an experiment, this is what data that already exists. So, like, to the extent that sort of there isn't sort of that policing feature, like we were able to kind of use the existing registries to kind of register a pre-analysis plan. But obviously in thinking about the framework of what this pre-analysis plan needed to have, there weren't some like templates that existed. So we just needed to really think about, with observational data, how do we actually pre-register things, and what are the pieces of information that really need to be there, so that people can really trust that we didn't sort of like look under the hood before actually running the analysis, and, you know, honestly did replications and honestly tried to do, you know, build on the existing framework to try to find the right specifications to use. But at least with the registry that we did try to upload, there wasn't this sort of, you know, you are not allowed to be registering something that's not of an experimental kind, or you know, using data that actually already exists. But what we have found is like there's not really a great, hasn't been this sort of building of a community and thinking about how do we do this with observational studies and how do we think about registering replications as well, which I think also applies to the experimental world, because I think a lot of the conversations have been about sort of the original initial study and not about replications, which are really important to do.
Quick question for Meredith. What do you think despite the law, the legal requirement, what do you think have been the challenges for universities to support researchers in reporting the results of their trials?
I think, again, I don't think it's sort of malicious. I don't think universities are doing this with any as sort of bad actors. And we've talked to a lot of different groups at different universities, and it's still an ongoing process. But I think there's a different number of challenges there's like high turnover of staff, just the time that it takes. I mean, we get a little frustrated with that as a primarily volunteer-based organization, but it takes they estimate around 40 hours per trial just to do the reporting, which in some ways seems quite small, but when you apply that to multiple trials, that's a lot of time. I think also just lack of awareness sometimes, lack of training, even difficulty with the clinicaltrials.gov website. It's actually definitely one of the better ones. If you compare it to like the EU process, there's like no helpline. It's not user-friendly at all, and it's quite complicated. So it's definitely an improvement over that. I think also some of the older records are not digitalized, so that's a challenge. But I do think a lot of the grants that you're receiving, public money, we know that $40 billion of NIH funding goes to universities every year to do biomedical research. About 1/3 of that 40 billion goes to clinical trials. So it's a lot of money. So I do think like if people are including it in the grants, there should be money behind it to do this. But I think we're moving in the right direction, as you can see, but we're not fully there yet. So we're trying to push people that way.
Just wanted to let everyone know, if you have any questions, yeah, Ted in the back.
Obstacle course.
Thanks. I have one comment and one question. The comment is first for Cecilia. Thanks for that great talk covering what I think a lot of us see as really like the frontier topic in social science research transparency, which is bringing these ideas into observational research. My comment for you is, for many of us who do experiments, we actually do something very similar to what you described in terms of internal policing. Very often in studies I've been involved in, including with people in this room, data collection starts and we haven't yet finished the pre-analysis plan. We're working on the pre-analysis plan. We want to add more. We're thinking more about it, but we may be a week or a month or 2 months into data collection. And what we do is we write what we call data management plans that everybody on the team, from the people in the field collecting the data to the researchers here, sign, stating that, this one individual in the field will have access to data just for cleaning purposes to make sure there's no problems with the data. But the people writing the pre-analysis plan have not seen it. We post that on the AEA registry as our data management plan. And then when we sort of register the pre-analysis plan a month later, we then update and say, okay, now everybody has access to the data. But we kind of like timestamp when we have access. So I think it's a kind of neat idea that even for observational research, if you have 5 or 10 people all attesting to a very specific plan around data access, it's not perfect, but it provides some credibility around access to data. So just wanted to let you know, I'm very happy to share those kinds of model data management plans. I'd love to see what you guys did. And then I have one question. Sorry to go on for so long. So that was a comment. And then I have a question maybe for everybody, which is, so far we've been framing the discussion around null results. Of course, that's critical. They're getting underreported. And for instance, there was the great IPL null results template. I mean, I think that's one of the really great starting points for the day. My question for all of us is, should we be focusing on a null results template from a pre-analysis plan, or just a results template from a pre-analysis plan? Should we just normalize it that when you write a pre-analysis plan, There's just a standard template that could be very streamlined for the basic results, null or not. And then, yes, some of those go on to be papers, some are not papers. And I wonder if that's a way just to, again, normalize this reporting. Null results and non-null results get reported. Some of them get published, some of them don't get published. But should one of the goals here just to be today, to be the development of like just a results template? Or should we really just focus on null results? And the reason I want to say that is early on in the econ literature, some of the famous transparency related topics around like minimum wage research weren't around null results, actually. They were around results that like had the wrong sign theoretically. So like people couldn't publish them. They weren't null results. They were like, you know, they could be null results. They could be strong in the wrong direction. They could be in the right direction. But there could be reasons results are not being reported even if they're not null because they go against theoretical priors. So are we being a little too narrow by just saying null results, or do we want to normalize just all pre-analysis plan results reporting? Anyway, that's just a question for the group.
If you guys,
Well, I really appreciate your comment, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that Ted is in the same campus, and hopefully I can set some time to connect with you, I'd love to sort of see how the existing frameworks with field experiments can be one that can sort of be aligned with how we're thinking about observational data, and the fact that the data has always been generated before like doing an analysis. I think your intuitions about a results template is right, because as we sort of think through original studies, replications and whatnot, sort of incentives sort of differ depending on kind of what it is. And to your point, it could also be that if the results are different from the theory, that's why it's not been reported, but it might just mean like we have to rethink the theory, and that there's a real reason why the signs are different, like that's an actual real result. I do wonder in terms of replications if there should also be thinking about a template for replications, as we thought really hard about like what do we do to be fair to the original studies as we sort of think about like what is like sort of the right specifications and whatnot, and that there was some value in showing here's the original results, here's the original analysis with the added data, and then here are the results when we're using a specification that a larger community of scholars sort of like thought was the best one and was pre-registered. And sort of like showing those differences seemed to really matter hugely, and kind of really thinking about like what happened here and how should we be really understanding this. So at least for, you know, as we're also trying to encourage things like replications, that maybe that there's also a template in thinking about what that should look like. But I'm completely aligned with sort of thinking about what, you know, maybe we should just think a bit broader, because there's different kinds of incentives and reasons for why something might not be published.
I would just add, like from our sort of very specific clinical trials angle, I think it's part of the reason that we are trying to push for all trials ultimately, because I think if you start, you know, it's all public money in the end, and going back to that ethical and moral, I think, obligation to do so, I think in the end it gets quite complicated if you're saying these types of trials versus those should be reported. So I would argue that in favor of what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, I would also agree. I mean, I think that one of the things that we see with the numbers that I reported on post-trial results on the registry is that most people are reporting when they have written up their results. So if a results template also is easy for those people who have written up and published a paper to just copy what they have and put it into there, then, you know, it's not added time on them, because a lot of times they might just say, well, look at my paper. You know, my paper's out there. You can go see that. And so that's why we've also just made it available for people to upload their papers to the registry when they're done with their study as well. So thinking about how it is easy for researchers to then just copy what they've already written up into that results template.
Great. Hi, I'm Philip Cohen from the University of Maryland. I really appreciate the panel. Thank you very much. Just a quick comment on that issue of publishing results versus papers. We have to recognize, I think, in that it's one of the places where there's a tension between science and the institutions of science, especially journals. Mm-hmm. Journals don't want to publish your paper months after you announce the results, because that's not their business model. So we just have to recognize that. So if you design your results template, you pre-register, and that you get that peer-reviewed or whatever, you have that's a good quality pre-registration, and then you do your research and you get the results, the results should just be a paragraph that you can add. Or something, a short amount, and it would be nice to announce that as soon as possible and get that into the flow of research for other people doing similar results, meta-analysis, and so on. But if you do that and then you take the time to write up a paper and send it to a journal, a lot of them won't like it at that point. So that's something we have to think about trying to change. But my comment was more for Cecilia on the observational data, which I really appreciate the effort to do that. I work in observational data like demography, and the data comes out all the time. And so one nice thing to do, sometimes it's not a big mystery, but you can still sort of make a prediction with this year's data for next year's data. And even if it might be boring, like the black unemployment rate's going to be higher than the white unemployment rate again next year. It's still legit to do it that way. It's just not it's not going to be very surprising. But if you are in the business of actually making predictions, like something is changing, like I wrote a paper that the divorce rate is going to keep falling, and then it fell again the next year, so that was good. So it's sort of it's the issue of like peaking is interesting, because a lot of the time when you're working with observational data, what you're doing is really descriptive in a way, and I think the problem is less peaking. In other words, peaking is not really a problem. I think the problem more is transparency and reproducibility. So you can have trust that you're not just p-hacking or finagling the data to get a result that you like. So you can say, yeah, I peaked, I crawled all over this data, and this is how I think is a good way to describe it. That's a perfectly legitimate kind of research to do. But you want to have that trail of what you did in some way, and also allow other people to, add that variable you decided to leave out or something like that. And then, so it's slightly orthogonal to the question of pre-registration, but for observational data, I think that's an important. Anyway, so thanks again.
Thank you.
Just one point on this. There is a list of medical journal editors who have come forward and said basically quite explicitly that this will not be a barrier to publication, which is encouraging. I can get the list. I don't have it in front of me, but if that's helpful, yeah.
Lars in the back.
Yeah, I had two comments that sort of come from listening here, and again, I'm an economist. I work a lot with observational data, and I work a lot with restricted access data. And so the idea that data is being continuously released, that data might not be accessible to everybody either through time or through some access restrictions, opens up the opportunity to say I've credibly not had access to this data in some fashion, either because it's 5 years in the future, because I know when the 2025 ACS will be released. I can write a paper that says, here's my whole analysis plan based on everything I've seen before. That's the observational part. And then here's my pre-registration. I do that. That actually is a bit of a tension with, should we then keep all the data back that we've collected so that we can record who gets access to it, which is against open access, but let's put that aside. There is this idea that in these observational studies, our publication model is completely not up to task for this kind of analysis. We're talking, I could do this with the ACS every year. Every year, everything I've done in the past is my pre-registration for what happens next year. But there's not a single academic publication that will update your paper continuously every year, right? Should there be is a different way of looking at some aspects of these things that says, as new information becomes available, the version of record that was first published, we know about that, but what do we need to think about as it moves forward, as new information comes around, and here's the revised version that is tightly linked to the previous one, and yes, as a journal, I'm still claiming credit for updating it, but it's not some stupid PDF that's stuck on a website somewhere that has no relationship to whatever's happened afterwards, right? That's part of where we're going with the data registration part of the replicability archives that opens up the opportunity to do that for the underlying materials, but it's a question we should ask ourselves maybe about new publication models. And just as a completely different side of that, we're talking a lot about how do we report results and how do we report the pre-registration. Put the two together, you've got a paper. So part of the reduction of the friction is if I already have gone through all the trouble of pre-registering everything into a template, can I get a LaTeX template out of it or something, whatever, that is actually 3/4 of my article already pre-written so I don't have to redo it all again? So reducing some of these frictions, integrating with some of these things might also be an incentive to comply with this more frequently, more rapidly, etc. I've gone through all that work. Now I just click on a button in the A registry and it pops it over into Overleaf and I've got 3/4 of my paper written. I'm happy and you are happy. And that's another thought to think about.
Sean in the back. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Andy was.
So in sort of, thinking about your struggles with getting people to post their post-analysis data, I just had a sort of thought, and maybe it's a silly thought, but it strikes me that one of the things that one could sort of look at is the extent to which those things are cited. And I don't know to what extent in your particular registers the post registers are separately citable, and to what extent those are picked up by Google Scholar. But if you ask me sort of what are my incentives to do them, one might be when I put the post-analysis plan, it starts building citations. Obviously in economics that mostly happens through working papers that sit on various places. One builds citations long before everything is ever published. But it also struck me that you could actually take your data and look at that question and even use some of your A/B tests to see if in fact there's effect on citation counts of getting your post-analysis plan, or at least being nudged, and therefore in the reduced form seeing to what extent that affects, say, citations on a particular research. If you could make a compelling case that doing this actually increases the visibility of your work, I think there might be some people who would respond to that, and so it's the data you have and could easily generate, I think, so it's maybe worth trying.
Sean.
Hey, Sean Grant, Indiana University. Thanks for a great panel. This question is primarily targeted towards those who are running a registry, so AEA, the OSF, if it looks like they're going this direction. Jessica Spybrook, people don't know her, she's led and designed the registry for education, Reese. It seems like a lot of the problems being tackled here are the ones that clinical trials have been tackling for almost 2 decades now. And in vein of comments like Ted's about, is this about getting all results out there, and not necessarily could be published, but just out there. Those of you who run registries, have you looked at CT.gov's results database, where as part of the requirements from the FDOD, the Amendments Act, and then the update, it's not necessarily posting a paper, but actually entering in the results into a database, like baseline data, summary outcome data, participant flow data, in a database that itself can be searched and linked up and be interoperable with other databases. So I'd just be curious to know how those of you in social science spaces have looked at that, grappled with that.
Sure, I can just talk that. I think we do try to follow clinical trials model as much as possible. I agree with you. They're definitely much more advanced than the registries in the social sciences so far. I mean, they've been working on this for a lot longer. Our current post-trial reporting fields are very generic. It's like, when did you complete data collection? When did the intervention end? And then you can upload a paper. I agree. I mean, I think possibly that could be one direction where we go, is add more fields where it is just what are some of the results, and just entering those right into the database itself, so that you don't have to, anyone who's going and trying doing meta-analysis doesn't have to, download all of the various reports that have been uploaded and then pull out the data. It could be certainly one thing that we would certainly like to go with, and maybe think about some more. I mean, there are some, we do have some fields on final sample size, observations, and a few other things, but no other results. Yeah.
Mary, do you think any social science registries could pull any important lessons from the medical trial
Certainly.
registry?
Certainly.
Of course, yeah. It's like
Is a yes. I mean, based on what you said as well, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think also just this bigger understanding that other actors can push for these similar outcomes. Like, we want to. I'm wondering who else. There's not a lot of people in this room, and who are the other groups who can be pushing to encourage the move towards these better practices, I think, as well, because it shows that universities on their own, even with the law, are not going all the way. So what can we all do to get them there? And whether that is actually getting the FDA to implement fines, I'm not sure. But I think even with that political framework, I think, and a transparency advocate at the head of clinicaltrials.gov pushing for this, even with that framework, I think, you know, it's been a challenge. So I think there's a long way to go, but I think we're moving in the right direction. Yeah.
I think David had a question.
Yeah.
Just a comment, and or maybe two comments. First, I think the low levels of post-reporting in the registration systems, whether it's OSF or AEA, that seems to be a problem that can be resolved, and already moves are being made. And this seems like an exciting opportunity to have an influence on no results. And thinking about ways, maybe in the afternoon sessions, of ways to incentivize higher levels of post-experiment reporting would be an important contribution to development of good science. To me, it's very exciting. The second thing, opened up by Cecilia, we've been ad hoc in our distinction between observational and experimental. And the whole, some good points have been made, but the whole incentive system is different. In experimental data, you have a treatment which you have a high incentive to want to have work. And the incentives are, in a sense, to cheat, to try to show that it did work. In observational work, that's not so much the case with fishing expeditions. You want to actually describe the world as best you can. And as Cecilia pointed out, one of the problems with observational research is that a replication that finds that the previous observation was correct has no place. You know, I did a study with Jim Fearon some 20 years ago, which has been replicated thousands of times in graduate school curricula. And 1 in 200, which finds some gotcha, is circulated, and all the others are said, well, I guess those guys got it right and dropped it. So in a sense, the incentive system in observational work is often to find null findings and not to show that your variable is working. And therefore, the reporting of null findings is a different kind of dynamic, and we might think about how we can address this problem in a different framework from the one we're working with in clinical studies.
Great. Well, I think we're running out of time, so with that, we'll conclude. We have about 10 minutes for a coffee break. I just want to thank the panelists for joining us today and for sharing their experiences. So Meredith, James, Cecilia, and Nikki on the Zoom line. Thank you, and thanks for all the great questions.